To be in the March on Washington meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
No pressure, not then, not now, not ever, how I'm stepping, no pressure, not then, not now, not ever.
What's up, team? Welcome to this very special episode of the Last Society podcast. I'm your host and CEO of One Team Publishing Films, The Black Pole. If this is your first time tuning in, I want to be the first one to tell you, welcome to the winning team. Alright, now we're going to take a break from our money-making series we've been covering to do this very special report on the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Martin Luther King Day. Happy Martin Luther King Day, everyone out there. Hope y'all had a blessed one. Now, this is what I wanted to cover. When I was doing my research on Dr. King, this one question kept coming across my mind. Why did they want to assassinate Dr. King? Was it the I Had a Dream speech? Was it the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? That couldn't have been it. That was in 64. He got killed in 68. All right, was it his advances he made on integration? That would seem like that was still a few years later. Okay, what about the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968? Does that make more sense? Well, I just really wondered, why did they want Dr. King dead that bad? Really? But then I ran across this interview Dr. King did 11 months before he was assassinated at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Y'all gotta see this, for real, straight up. For those who like to criticize Dr. King, yeah, I'm gonna speak on it. You know, there are some who like to criticize Dr. King. They like to say he was too soft because his stance of nonviolence with his approach. They like to say he was passive. Some people like to say he left us without a plan. For those naysayers who didn't know the real Dr. King, I just want to tell you this. I'm going to show you the real Dr. King. I'm not going to do a lot of talking during this interview. I'm going to go ahead and provide commentary when necessary, but I will be taking my notes. Let's go.
Smith, Civil Rights, King, MLK, roll 20, sound 36.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here in the university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community
you catch that? One of the main places that he was able to catch his target audience was the church. Isn't that significant? How do we see the church today? Is that still our cornerstone? If we needed to get a message to black people, can we give it in the church still? Stay on that.
Permanently church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
In addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We about 10...
Did you hear that? It was impractical for the African Americans to use violence at that time. Impractical.
Or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern Ghetto. I have
3 or 4 years ago, he was talking about Malcolm X, especially when Malcolm X came back from Mecca, and he was on his own, and he had got the true word of Islam and wanted to have this unity. And you remember what Malcolm X wanted to do when he got back? He wanted to link up with Malcolm X, he wanted to link up with Martin, form this coalition, still nonviolence, by any means necessary, protect myself. He was always on that, but he wasn't about violence. He's taught that when he got back from Mecca. And he wanted to sue the United States in the United Nations for human rights. And then he got assassinated. We talking about Malcolm now. So that was a big X right there on that movement up north.
Feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern Ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Whereas in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win, and it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains. Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel
In the North, what still takes place today, we're talking about rent control. We're talking about people in low-income communities paying higher rent and people making more money. That's racism in the housing market. That's still going on today. I apologize, Dr. King. Please continue.
that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it?
You see that? Economics. It all goes back to economics. Now you see that? We talk about economics. It's all relative. I'm bringing you back still to the last society, and when we talk about this money-making series, we're still there. Dr. King was starting to focus on economics. He was starting to focus on that check. That's when he pivoted in his movement. Pay attention. This is where it gets crucial.
I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums.
Okay. Is Dr. King here talking about 1967? Or is he talking about 2021? Doesn't it all sound familiar?
And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they are coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they are coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger, and then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even 65 of the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now?
See, he was calling people out. First of all, did you notice he was trying to get the North organized with the South? He was trying to unite the two, because when he passed the Civil Rights Act of when we had participated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, that was predominantly a Southern movement of Southern blacks. But of course, you know, you had prominent people from the North as well. I mean, blacks from all over and people from all over, period. But it was no real movement of the North, especially after, I would say, Malcolm X got assassinated.
The people knew the Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society, in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism. Do you have any idea what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they are a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality, and they're always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land, on nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression, and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Did you hear that? Bootless. Bootless out of slavery. You didn't know that about the European immigrants, did you? Coming over this country, getting millions of acres. Do your research. It's there. Okay, we talk about during the Civil War, General Sherman, promised the Negro, the slave who fought against slavery during the Civil War, 40 acres and a mule. During Reconstruction, a lot of people, African Americans, ex-slaves, cashed in on that. Andrew Johnson did away with that. In 1876, they had a disputed election. To resolve that dispute, they decided to do away with Reconstruction. You wonder why the African American didn't have no boots? Well, they was given the boots and they took them right off. Because not only did not get 40 acres and a mule, but the Union took the army out of the South. When they took the army out of the South, part of this compromise in 1877, guess who moved in? The Klan moved in. Tyranny moved in on the black man. Well, the land they did have, they started burning and tearing it down. That's where you get Rosewood from. That's where you get Tulsa, Oklahoma from. That's where you get Jim Crow from. That happened because Reconstruction was ended in 1877. That's why we couldn't get our boots on the ground after Reconstruction. Economic base is what they got when they came over here, but you send the African Americans, the former slaves, to hunger.
Apart from wanting to live there, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology. Nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro.
You're talking about black on black crime right there. That's what he's talking about. It's become pathological. So scarred though. Cause and effect. Remember this, cause and effect. When you look at the effect of crime in our neighborhoods and what's going on, what's the cause of that? It still stems from us hitting the ground bootless after slavery ended.
Unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men. They want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class.
Did you get that? Did you understand what he was talking about right there? When he says they want to be men, throughout society, a man is supposed to put food on the table. You understand? Supposed to be able to provide for his family. When a man cannot put food on the table and provide for his family, he feels worthless.
Do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class, or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, our background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. And it seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood in the Lincoln Memorial that day in August '63, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes? Is that what you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64, 1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has in many forms turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future.
Did you just hear that? Did you just hear that? He said the dream has turned into a nightmare. You sure you know, Dr. King? You sure he wasn't speaking to you right now? Listen.
Sure. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.
Dr. King, even if there had not been a war in Asia, would you still not have had this nightmare insofar as the Negro movement for equality then touched on two things that the white community holds sacred: their children and their property?
Oh, I have no doubt that we would have encountered great difficulties, great problems of resistance if the war had not been in existence. So that I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended. But I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse the conscience during the time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, a Negro was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence, and it strengthened the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult, because I think we can go along with some programs, if we didn't have the war on our hands, that would cause people to adjust to new developments.
Did you hear that? Didn't they just have a shooting in Chicago? How many shootings are they having in Chicago? This is over 50 years ago. They were talking about, oh my gosh. Yeah.
They did in the South. They said they'd never ride the bus with us, blood would flow in the streets, they wouldn't go to school, and all of these things.
Did you hear that? Did you hear the significance of that? He was talking about a young black man being shot by the police in Chicago. This is in the 50s. It sounds familiar like it's still today, right? You see that?
When people came to see that they had to do it because the law insisted, they finally adjusted. And I think white people all over this country will adjust once the nation makes it clear that in schools, in housing, we've got to learn to live together as brothers. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now I think this is where we are getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
That's what got Dr. King assassinated, in my personal, honest opinion from the research I've done. He was telling America it's time to cut the check. It's time for economic relief from us being left bootless out of slavery during Reconstruction. He had gotten up to the point where he can get all of the equality he can socially. Now he was moving economically to get relief for the black man and woman. And he was assassinated for that. Thank you for tuning into this special episode of the Last Society podcast. I hope you realize that Dr. King left us with a plan. And he was a martyr. He gave us instructions. You gotta go get that check cut. Go after the check. And they killed him for it. God rest his soul. May God have mercy on our souls. God bless. One team. Hold up. Before you get out of here, I got one more thing for you, and it's actually breaking news. One Team Publishing and Films is officially offering membership to anybody who wants to change their lives socially, economically, and spiritually. This is how you do it. First thing I need you to do is subscribe to the YouTube channel, One Team Publishing and Films, so not only to get to keep up with the Last Society podcast, but you can check out the other great works that we do. Next thing I need you to do is purchase both books the podcast is based on, and that's From No Collar to a White Collar and The Last Society. When we dig deep in these books, I want you to be able to track the information. A lot of this information you have to decode it, and the decoder is in the books. You got to get the books to keep up with what we're doing. Once you get your proof of purchase, take those, email them to 1team615@gmail.com. Take your proofs of purchase, email them to 1team615@gmail.com. So we know who you are, the official member. You will start getting a newsletter with exclusive information that won't be on any media outlet. You can order the books at 1team615.com. Again, you can order the books at 1team615.com. Then you're official member of One Team. Start immediately, change your life, and start winning. You're gonna be part of the winning team. Welcome aboard. One Team. God bless.